My name is Emily. I'm in my mid-30s now. And for most of my adult life, I've worked in roles that reward consistency more than visibility. I've been a project lead, a systems thinker, the person who notices what's missing and quietly fills the gap. People often describe me as calm, reliable, low drama. Sometimes they mean it as praise. Sometimes it's a way of saying I don't need much attention. I've learned that when you move through the world without demanding space, people tend to underestimate the weight of your inner life. They assume silence means agreement, distance means indifference, and patience means weakness. This story isn't about proving them wrong in a loud way. It's about time, distance, and the slow accumulation of choices that don't look like choices until they are. I ignored my parents for years until I found their unopened letters. And the line that sits at the center of it, the one that took me the longest to admit out loud, is this. They kept writing. I kept not reading. What follows isn't a story of rebellion or revenge. There's no shouting match, no final speech where everyone suddenly understands. There's no villain reveal. If anything, it's a documentary of small moments, missed cues, quiet realizations, and the long emotional math we do to survive the roles we're assigned. I'll take you through who I was to my parents, how that version of me formed, and why stepping away didn't feel dramatic at the time. I'll talk about the first small cut, so small it barely registered, and how repetition can normalize pain without ever naming it. I'll explain how silence, at some point, stopped being a reaction and became a decision. And then there are the letters. I won't spoil what was in them, not because it's shocking, but because the impact had less to do with the words on the page and more to do with the years they waited, in the dark, unopened, while I was building a life that no longer had room for them. This isn't a story about good parents or bad parents. It's about misalignment, about how love can exist alongside erasure, about how a child can grow into an adult who chooses distance not out of anger, but out of clarity. I'm not here to dramatize pain or polish it into something heroic. I'm here to be honest about how quiet dominance actually works, not as control over others, but as ownership of self. The kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that looks like nothing until it changes everything. If you've ever been seen as the easy one, if you've ever been praised for not needing much, or if you've ever wondered whether silence can still carry intention, I want to ask you gently before we go any further. Have you ever stepped back from someone not because you stopped caring, but because you finally started listening to yourself? To my parents, I was the easy child, not the brilliant one, not the fragile one, not the loud one who needed constant adjustment. I was the one who adapted, the one who didn't argue when plans changed, who didn't cry for long, who learned early that harmony was a form of currency. If something needed to be done, I did it. If something needed to be understood, I understood it, quietly. They used to say it with affection. Emily's fine. She's independent. She doesn't need much. And because I love them, I let those words settle into my bones like truth. In family photos, I'm usually standing slightly apart, not distant, just positioned. I'm smiling but not reaching, present but not centered. At gatherings, I was the one clearing plates while conversations continued without pause. If someone needed help setting up, they called my name. If someone needed emotional reassurance, they looked elsewhere. I don't think my parents ever sat down and decided this would be my role. It happened the way these things often do, through repetition, convenience, and the quiet relief of knowing at least one child wouldn't complicate things. I was reliable, which meant I was predictable. And predictable people are easy to overlook. When I moved out for university, there was no dramatic goodbye. No speeches about missing me, just a checklist of logistics. My mother asked if I'd packed enough sweaters. My father reminded me to call if I needed anything. I nodded. I always nodded. What I didn't realize then was that I was already practicing disappearance. Phone calls became shorter, then less frequent. Not because I was angry, but because there was never much to say. When I talked about my life, it felt like reporting, not sharing. Updates were received politely, but were stored nowhere. My parents were still involved, but in the way you're involved with a weather forecast. Interested, but not changed by it. If I didn't call for weeks, no one worried. If I did call, no one asked why it had been so long. That silence didn't feel like neglect at the time. It felt like freedom. I told myself this was what healthy independence looked like. I was building a life. They trusted me. Everything was fine. But there's a difference between being trusted and being unmissed. When holidays came around, I adjusted my schedule to fit theirs. I arrived with gifts carefully chosen, stories carefully edited. I listened more than I spoke. When conversations drifted toward memories, I noticed how often I was absent from them, not physically, but narratively. Stories featured my siblings' struggles, their triumphs, and their turning points. When my name came up, it was usually as a contrast. Emily was always so steady. She never gave us trouble, said with pride, felt like erasure. I learned early that being low maintenance earned approval, so I became very good at it. I stopped expressing disappointment in real time. I delayed reactions until they no longer mattered. I internalized the idea that if something hurt quietly enough, it barely counted. From the outside, I looked emotionally mature, grounded, self-sufficient. From the inside, I was slowly unlearning how to ask. There were moments, small ones, when something in me noticed the imbalance. A birthday card signed without a message. A missed milestone was brushed off with, "We'll celebrate next time." A phone call where my mother spoke for 20 minutes about someone else's problem before realizing she hadn't asked how I was. Each time I told myself it wasn't intentional, that love doesn't always look attentive, that parents are human, that families settle into patterns, and patterns, once settled, feel permanent. What I didn't understand then was that roles don't just describe you. They shape the limits of how others are willing to see you. Once you become the one who's fine, your pain stops fitting the story. Your needs feel inconvenient. Your silence becomes expected. I wasn't invisible because I was unlovable. I was invisible because I made it easy. And for a long time, I mistook that ease for strength. The first time it happened, I almost missed it. That's what made it dangerous. It wasn't a fight. There was no raised voice, no accusation sharp enough to leave a mark. It was a sentence said casually in passing, wrapped in practicality. The kind of moment that disappears if you don't slow down long enough to notice how it lands in your body. I had just started my first serious job after university. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. I was proud of it in a careful way. Proud enough to want my parents to know, but not proud enough to make a scene about it. I called home to share the news, expecting something. Interest, maybe. A question or two. My father listened, then said, "That sounds stable. Good. At least you won't struggle. At least." The word didn't sting on its own. It was the tone. The way the conversation immediately moved on was as if the chapter had already been summarized and shelved. No curiosity about why I chose that path. No asking what excited me, just relieved that I wouldn't need help. I remember standing in my small apartment afterward, phone still warm in my hand, trying to locate the feeling. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness. It was more like a quiet disorientation, as if I'd offered something and watched it pass through someone without resistance. I told myself I was being sensitive. Everyone else would have. My friends shrugged when I mentioned it. "Your parents just worry differently," one of them said. "They're probably proud in their own way." Another laughed and told me I should be grateful my family wasn't dramatic. And I agreed, out loud. Inside, I filed the moment away. That's how the first cut works. It doesn't demand a response. It asks for minimization. And I was very good at that. I had years of practice. A few months later, I visited home for a weekend. Over dinner, my mother mentioned a decision she'd made that affected the whole family. It involved travel plans, a long-standing tradition. I found out at the table, at the same time as a distant relative, on speakerphone. I asked lightly, "When were you going to tell me?" She blinked, genuinely surprised. "Oh, I didn't think it mattered to you. You're always flexible." Always. There it was again. That invisible contract I never remembered signing. The assumption that my adaptability meant consent, that my lack of protest meant a lack of preference. I smiled. I always smiled. I didn't want to make her feel bad. I didn't want to be difficult. I didn't want to turn a small thing into a big thing. So I swallowed the discomfort and told myself the familiar story. This is just how families are. No one is trying to hurt you. But something had shifted, not outwardly. Nothing changed in how I behaved. I still showed up, still helped, still listened, still made space. The shift was internal, a subtle recalibration. I started noticing how often decisions were made around me instead of with me, how updates replaced conversations, how my life was acknowledged only insofar as it didn't disrupt theirs. It wasn't cruelty, it was convenient. And convenience is harder to confront because it doesn't look wrong enough to justify distance. The strange part is that the people who love you most often don't see these moments at all. They remember the big gestures, the sacrifices, the support they offered years ago. And those things are real, they count. But so do the small omissions, the unasked questions, the assumptions that harden into truth because no one challenges them. I didn't challenge them. I told myself that being understanding was the same as being strong, that maturity meant absorbing disappointment without complaint. My role was to keep things smooth. I hadn't yet seen that every unspoken reaction was teaching them something about me, that I would adapt, that I would wait, that I would not push back. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, that lesson became the foundation of how they treated me. The first small cut didn't hurt because it was small. It hurt because it went unacknowledged, by them and by me. Once you explain something away enough times, it stops asking for explanation. That's how normalization works. Not through one defining moment, but through a series of small adjustments you make to protect the image of the people you love and the version of yourself that can coexist with them. After that first cut, I became more skilled at interpretation. I learned how to translate dismissal into neutrality, absence into busyness, and assumptions into accidents. It wasn't conscious. It was survival wrapped in politeness. When my parents forgot to tell me about a family gathering until the night before, I told myself they assumed I was busy. When my opinion wasn't asked during conversations about plans that would affect me, I reminded myself that I could always adapt. When my achievements were met with a brief nod and a subject change, I convinced myself that external validation wasn't something I needed. And maybe I didn't need it, but wanting to be seen isn't a weakness. The pattern grew clearer over time, but clarity doesn't always lead to action. Sometimes it leads to better excuses. I noticed how my siblings were consulted, reassured, and emotionally negotiated with. Their boundaries were treated as real. Their reactions were anticipated. With me, the assumption was always the same. Emily will understand. And I did, until I started wondering why understanding was expected of me, but not extended to me. There was a specific moment, small, almost laughable, when I realized how deep this had gone. My mother was recounting a story to a friend, something I had experienced directly. She got a detail wrong. Not a dramatic one, just enough to change the meaning. I corrected her gently. She waved her hand. No, that's not how it happened. I paused. I was there. She smiled, indulgent. I know, honey, you remember things differently. The conversation moved on. Everyone else accepted her version. I sat there, quiet, feeling something settle into place. It wasn't that she disagreed with me. It was that my perspective carried less weight, even in my own story. That's when I began to see the cost of being low maintenance. People stop checking in. They stop adjusting. They stop assuming you might have a limit. And because I rarely expressed mine, they assumed I didn't have any. I want to be clear about something. My parents were not malicious. They didn't mock me or belittle me outright. That would have been easier to name. Harder to forgive, maybe, but clearer. This was softer, more insidious, a kind of emotional background noise that slowly teaches you to shrink without ever being told to. I normalized it by reframing it as maturity. When I didn't speak up, I called it grace. When I let things slide, I called it empathy. When I swallowed resentment, I called it growth. The truth was less flattering. I was afraid that if I asked for more, I would be seen as ungrateful. Afraid that any assertion would disrupt the fragile equilibrium I'd helped create. Afraid that stepping out of the role would cost me whatever affection was attached to it. So I stayed quiet, and my quiet was interpreted as consent. Over time, I began to anticipate disappointment and pre-adjust my expectations. I stopped sharing things that mattered to me because the response felt worse than silence. I curated myself, edited my emotions, offered only the parts that fit the family narrative. And because I wasn't visibly hurting, no one noticed that I was disappearing. That's the danger of normalized disrespect. It doesn't feel like abuse. It feels like being reasonable. It feels like being the bigger person. It feels like choosing peace. Until one day you realize that peace has only ever been one-sided. I wasn't angry yet. Anger requires a sense of injustice, and I had spent years convincing myself this was just how love looked. But something else had begun to grow, quieter, heavier. Detachment. Not withdrawal, not rebellion, just a subtle loosening of emotional investment. I still showed up, but I stopped expecting to be held in mind when I wasn't there. I stopped assuming my presence mattered. And when you stop expecting to matter, you begin to prepare, without realizing it, for a life where you don't need to. That preparation didn't announce itself. It didn't feel dramatic. It felt like practicality, like adulthood, like strength. It would be a long time before I understood what it was actually leading me toward. Roles don't arrive with instructions. They form quietly, through repetition, until stepping outside of them feels like breaking an unspoken rule. By the time you notice, everyone else has already memorized their lines and expects you to do the same. In my family, my role was simple. I was the reliable one, the capable one, the one who would step in without being asked and step back without complaint. I wasn't the emotional center. I wasn't the problem solver in moments of crisis. That role went to whoever needed the most reassurance at the time. I was the infrastructure. The background system kept things running smoothly. When someone needed help moving, I was called. When someone needed a form filled out, I was forwarded the email. When someone needed emotional validation, I listened. But when I needed something, the assumption was that I already had it handled. At first, that role felt flattering. Being needed, even in a functional way, felt like belonging. I told myself that not everyone gets to be dramatic or adored. Some people are trusted, some people are dependent on, and that was better, wasn't it? But dependence without consideration is just extraction with good manners. The more I fulfilled the role, the narrower it became. I was no longer seen as someone whose circumstances might change, whose limits might be reached, whose priorities might conflict with the family's convenience. I was a constant in other people's plans. And constants aren't consulted, they're assumed. I remember one conversation in particular. My parents were discussing a future arrangement. Long-term, impactful. It involved logistics I would be directly responsible for. I listened for a while, waiting for the moment they would turn to me and ask what I thought. They never did. When I finally spoke, offering a measured concern, my father looked surprised. Not defensive, not angry, just surprised. "Oh," he said, "I thought you'd be fine with it." That sentence carried years of conditioning in it. Fine. Always fine. Conveniently fine. I could have corrected him. I could have said, "I'm not fine with it." But the room felt fragile, balanced on the assumption of my compliance. And I had learned that disrupting that balance came with consequences. Awkwardness, disappointment, the subtle withdrawal of warmth. So I did what I had always done. I adjusted. What I didn't realize was that every adjustment was teaching them something about the limits of my presence. Not because they were cruel, but because people tend to believe what our behavior consistently tells them. And my behavior said, "You don't need to check in with me." Over time, the role became self-reinforcing. The less they asked, the less I offered. The less I offered, the more invisible my inner life became. I stopped correcting misunderstandings, stopped clarifying assumptions, stopped volunteering context. I wasn't hiding. I was conserving. There's a difference. I began to see myself through their eyes, not as a full person with evolving needs, but as a function. The one who smooths transitions, the one who absorbs inconvenience, the one who doesn't complicate things. And once you are seen as functional, asking for emotional space feels like a malfunction. I want to be careful here. This wasn't martyrdom. I wasn't sacrificing myself nobly. I was choosing familiarity over friction, predictability over risk, and at the time it felt like the mature choice. But maturity without self-respect eventually turns into quiet resentment. I didn't lash out. I didn't confront. I didn't even name it to myself yet. I simply started detaching from the role emotionally, performing it without inhabiting it. And that detachment created room, space I had never had before. In that space, a question began to form. Not loudly, not urgently, but persistently. If I stopped fulfilling this role, who would I be to them? I didn't have an answer yet, but the question itself was the beginning of something that would not involve confrontation, something that would not require permission, something that would unfold slowly, in silence. The day something shifted didn't announce itself. There was no argument, no ultimatum, no moment where I stood up and finally said everything I'd been holding in. If you'd looked at my life from the outside, nothing would have appeared different at all. That's what makes it hard to explain. It was an ordinary afternoon. I was visiting my parents, sitting at the kitchen table where I'd done homework years earlier. The light was the same, soft, indirect, familiar. My mother was talking about a problem one of my siblings was having. I listened, nodded, and offered a practical suggestion when asked. At some point, she paused and said, "You're so good at being objective." It was meant as a compliment. Something in me went still. Not hurt, not angry, just still. As if a piece of information had finally settled into the correct place. Objective. That word confirmed what I had been circling for years without naming. I wasn't seen as someone inside the emotional field of the family. I was positioned outside of it, useful for perspective, for balance, for support, but not someone whose feelings were part of the equation. In that moment, I realized something quietly devastating and strangely freeing at the same time. I had been emotionally promoted out of consideration. I smiled, like I always did. The conversation continued. Nothing cracked on the surface, but internally something clicked into focus. I saw the pattern clearly for the first time, not as a series of isolated incidents, but as a structure, a system that functioned because I complied with it. And systems don't change because you feel bad inside them. They change when participation shifts. I didn't decide anything that day. I didn't make a plan or draw a boundary. I simply stopped lying to myself about the cost of my role. That evening, I went back to my apartment and sat in silence. No music, no phone, just the awareness of how tired I was, not physically, but emotionally. Tired of translating myself into something easier to manage. Tired of being proud of how little I asked for. For the first time, I let the truth land without softening it. I'm not emotionally known in my own family. Naming it didn't break me, it clarified me. I thought about all the times I'd chosen patience over presence. All the moments I'd deferred connection because it seemed unnecessary. All the ways I'd protected them from my inner life so thoroughly that they'd forgotten it existed. And then another thought followed, quieter but more powerful. If they don't know me now, it's because I helped build this version of myself. That realization was important. It meant I wasn't powerless. It also meant I couldn't keep pretending this was something being done to me. The shift wasn't about blame, it was about agency. Over the next few weeks, nothing changed outwardly. I still called, still visited, still listened. But internally, I stopped expecting emotional reciprocity, and that expectation, once released, created a surprising sense of calm. I wasn't waiting anymore. When my parents spoke, I listened without leaning forward. When they made assumptions about my availability or preferences, I noticed without correcting them. I began observing instead of participating fully. Not out of spite, out of curiosity. What would happen if I stopped filling in the gaps? The answer slowly was nothing. The system continued exactly as it had before. My silence went unnoticed. My emotional withdrawal registered as normal. And that told me everything I needed to know. The shift wasn't loud. It didn't demand acknowledgement. But it changed the way I saw my own responsibility in the dynamic. I understood then that distance doesn't always begin with absence. Sometimes it begins with clarity. The moment you stop hoping someone will finally see you, you can just explain yourself better. I didn't feel numb. I felt grounded. Because once you see a system clearly, you can decide how much of yourself it deserves. That day, at a quiet kitchen table, I didn't walk away from my family, but I did step out of a role. Silence is different when it's no longer accidental. Before, my quiet had been reactive, a way to avoid conflict, to preserve harmony, to stay within the role that had been assigned to me. But after that shift, silence became deliberate, not withholding, not passive-aggressive, just intentional. I stopped volunteering information, not everything, just the parts of my life that required emotional engagement to hold. I shared facts instead of feelings, updates instead of reflections. If asked how I was, I answered honestly but economically. No elaboration, no invitation. What surprised me was how little resistance there was. My parents didn't push for more. They didn't ask follow-up questions. They didn't sense that something was missing. They accepted the surface-level connection easily because that's what they had been accustomed to. And in that acceptance, I found confirmation. Silence, when chosen, can be diagnostic. I began to notice how often people interpret quiet as availability. Because if you're not speaking up, they assume you're fine. And if you're fine, there's no need to adjust. They mistook my restraint for agreement. At family gatherings, I arrived on time, helped when asked, and left without lingering. I no longer stayed late to smooth conversations or anticipate needs. I didn't insert myself where I wasn't explicitly invited. It wasn't cold, it was precise. Internally, I was taking notes, not in a literal sense, but in awareness. Who reached out when I didn't? Who noticed when I pulled back? Who adjusted their behavior in response to my changed presence? The answer again was quiet. My parents continued as if nothing had changed. They filled the space with what was familiar. They talked to me, not with me. And because I wasn't interrupting the pattern, they had no reason to re-examine it. What they didn't realize was that my silence had shifted from endurance to observation. This was the phase others later misinterpreted as emotional withdrawal. They assumed I was busy, or tired, or going through something unrelated. They never asked. And because they never asked, I didn't explain. There's a particular kind of power that comes from no longer needing to be understood by the people who misunderstand you. Not in a superior way, in a grounded way. It frees up energy. I started investing that energy elsewhere. In my work, I took on projects that required long-term thinking. I refined skills that didn't depend on external validation. I built a life that was internally coherent, even if it wasn't mirrored back to me at home. The more solid my inner world became, the less I needed my family to reflect it. And here's the part that's uncomfortable to admit. My parents interpreted my calm as weakness. They assumed that because I wasn't pushing back, I would always be there in the same capacity. That my availability was permanent, that my emotional neutrality meant there were no stakes. They didn't see that my silence was no longer an offering. It was a boundary. Not one announced, one enacted. There's a misconception that boundaries have to be verbalized to be real, but sometimes the clearest boundaries are behavioral. They show up as changed patterns, not declarations. I wasn't punishing them, I was recentering myself. And in doing so, I allowed the natural consequences of the dynamic to begin unfolding without interference. The distance between us didn't feel dramatic. It felt clean, measured, almost peaceful. If anything, I felt more present than I had in years, because I wasn't managing other people's comfort at the expense of my own. Silence had become a choice, and choice, even when quiet, carries intention. I didn't yet know where that intention would lead. I only knew that I was no longer willing to be emotionally available by default. And once that door closed, another began to open. Slowly, privately, and without announcement. What they never noticed wasn't a single action. It was the accumulation. While everything on the surface remained familiar, calls on birthdays, polite check-ins, shared holidays, I was quietly rearranging my internal world. Not in opposition to them, in preparation for myself. When you stop spending energy translating your needs into something palatable, you suddenly have a surplus. And I didn't waste it, I started paying attention to patterns, not just in my family, but everywhere. How people respond to absence versus presence. How systems adapt when one dependable part stops compensating. How often emotional labor goes unseen because it's been done too well. At work, I documented everything, not out of fear, but out of clarity. I learned which contributions were assumed and which were acknowledged. I positioned myself carefully, not loudly, not aggressively, but unmistakably. I stopped filling gaps that weren't mine to fill. When something failed because I didn't intervene, I let it fail. No one accused me of neglect. They simply noticed, for the first time, what I had been holding together. That awareness changed how I valued myself. In my personal life, I built routines that didn't orbit my family's expectations. Weekends became quieter, decisions became more intentional. I stopped planning around hypothetical needs that no one had actually voiced. And here's the part that mattered most. I stopped explaining my choices. Explanation had always been my bridge back into invisibility. The more I explained, the more my decisions became negotiable. So I didn't. If I couldn't attend something, I said I couldn't attend. No apology, no justification, just information. They accepted it easily, too easily. That was when I realized how little emotional access they had been requesting all along. My constant availability had filled a silence they didn't know how to engage with directly. The preparation wasn't dramatic. It looked like ordinary adulthood, like self-sufficiency, like growth. But internally, I was building something solid enough to stand without their recognition. I began journaling, not about them, but about me, about what I wanted my life to feel like, about the values I had been living by versus the ones I wanted to live for. I noticed how often my moral code had been shaped by not wanting to inconvenience others. That stopped. I didn't become selfish, I became exact. There's a difference. I also started reviewing practical realities, logistics, contingencies, long-term planning. Not because I anticipated conflict, but because independence isn't just emotional, it's structural. I made sure that if I stepped back further, nothing essential would collapse. What they never noticed was how deliberate this all was. They mistook my calm for passivity, my consistency for permanence, my lack of protest for loyalty. They didn't see the quiet competence behind it, the kind that doesn't need permission to redirect itself. And because they didn't see it, they didn't respond. Which confirmed what I had already learned. Awareness only arrives when inconvenience does. By the time they might have noticed something shifting, the shift was already complete. I wasn't becoming distant to be noticed. I was becoming whole. And wholeness doesn't announce itself to people who benefited from your fragmentation. This phase wasn't about leverage yet. It was about readiness, about knowing with certainty that whatever came next wouldn't be driven by reaction or resentment. I was calm because I was prepared. I was quiet because I was aligned. And I was invisible, still, but no longer in a way that cost me anything. That was the part they never noticed. The reveal didn't come with a rush of adrenaline. There was no moment where I sat back and thought, this changes everything. It was quieter than that, slower, almost procedural. I was cleaning out a storage box one afternoon. Old documents, things I'd carried with me through multiple moves without ever opening. Papers you keep because they feel important, even when you don't remember why. At the bottom of the box was a bundle of envelopes. Same handwriting, same return address, different dates. My parents, I knew immediately what they were. Letters they had sent over the years, during periods when I hadn't been very responsive. Times when I was busy, or tired, or simply uninterested in reopening emotional channels I didn't have the capacity to manage. I had told myself I'd read them later. Later never came. What struck me wasn't guilt. It was a surprise at how little urgency I felt. The letters weren't unopened because I was angry. They were unopened because I had learned, slowly, carefully, that opening them came with an emotional responsibility I hadn't agreed to carry anymore. They kept writing. I kept not reading. I sat on the floor with the box beside me and held one envelope in my hands. The paper was slightly yellowed. The stamp marked a year I barely remembered. Whatever was inside had waited patiently for a version of me that no longer existed. And in that moment, I understood something with absolute clarity. Distance doesn't always look like rejection. Sometimes it looks like unread mail. The leverage wasn't in the content of the letters. I didn't even know what they said yet. The leverage was in the pattern they represented, and the choice I had made consistently not to engage. For years, my parents had been telling a story, to themselves and to others, about how independent I was, how I didn't need much, I was doing fine on my own. The unopened letters contradicted that story. They revealed effort, concern, reaching out, but also, importantly, delay. They hadn't called to ask why I wasn't responding. They hadn't adjusted their approach. They hadn't asked what kind of connection I wanted. They had written, sent, and waited. That waiting told me everything. I finally opened one. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't manipulative, it wasn't cruel, it was polite, careful, observational. My mother wrote about everyday things. My father added a short note at the bottom. They asked how I was and said they hoped I was well. They didn't ask why I hadn't replied. That omission mattered. It meant my silence had been absorbed, not confronted, accommodated, not examined. I read a few more. The tone stayed the same, gentle, reserved, respectful, but distant in its own way. They were writing around me, not to me. And that's when the private reveal fully landed. The dynamic wasn't one-sided neglect. It was mutual avoidance dressed as respect. They had learned not to push. I had learned not to open. We were all maintaining equilibrium, just at a greater emotional distance than anyone was willing to name. The clarity didn't make me sad. It made me steady. Because now I knew. If I chose to stay silent, it wouldn't shock them. And if I chose to step away further, it wouldn't come out of nowhere. The groundwork had already been laid by all of us. The unopened letters weren't a weapon. They weren't evidence to present or guilt to wield. They were confirmed. Confirmation that I had more control over the relationship than I'd ever admitted. Confirmation that distance had already been normalized. Confirmation that whatever decision came next would not be impulsive. I put the letters back in the box, not all of them opened. Not all of them are unread. Just enough. Enough to understand the shape of the truth without drowning in it. That was the reveal. Not dramatic, not emotional. Just clear. Once something is clear, pretending it isn't becomes exhausting. The unopened letters didn't force a decision, but they made avoidance impossible. I couldn't unknow what I now understood, that the distance between my parents and me wasn't accidental, and it wasn't entirely theirs to fix. I was standing at a quiet intersection with more than one path available. I could open all the letters, respond carefully, and re-enter the emotional rhythm we'd settled into. Polite, contained, surface level. It would be easy, familiar, low risk. I could confront them, name the years of invisibility, explain how their assumptions had shaped me, ask for something different. That path carried the illusion of resolution, but it also carried a cost I wasn't sure I was willing to pay. Emotional exposure to people who had never shown they knew how to hold it. Or I could do the irreversible thing, not dramatically, not angrily, but deliberately. I could continue stepping back, not as a phase, but as a permanent recalibration. I could accept that this relationship would not deepen unless they initiated a change, and I could stop managing that absence on their behalf. That option didn't feel cruel. It felt honest. What made it irreversible wasn't the action itself. It was the internal commitment to stop revisiting the decision, to stop hoping that clarity alone would inspire transformation in others. I thought about the version of myself who had spent years being fine, who had waited for recognition that never arrived, who had equated endurance with love. And I realized something that surprised me. I didn't want them to finally see me. I wanted to stop needing them to. That realization simplified everything. The decision wasn't about punishment or withdrawal. It was about alignment, about choosing the life I had already been building over the role I had outgrown. So I chose the path that required the least performance. I didn't announce anything. I didn't set a rule or issue a boundary statement. I simply stopped initiating contact. I replied when they reached out, kindly, briefly. I acknowledged holidays. I expressed care without elaboration. I didn't escalate, intensify, or repair. And I didn't explain. Explanation would have reopened a negotiation I was no longer interested in having. This was the irreversible part, not the distance itself, but the refusal to justify it. I knew what this would look like from the outside. Cold, unfeeling, possibly ungrateful. I had already been cast as the one who didn't need much. This choice fit that narrative perfectly, and I was finally okay with that. The strange thing about choosing yourself quietly is that no one reacts right away. There's no immediate backlash, no confrontation, no drama, just a gradual shift in expectations. They would feel it later when they reached out and found less access than before, when they realized I was no longer filling in emotional gaps automatically, when my absence became logistical instead of theoretical. But by then, the decision would already be made. The point of no return wasn't a moment. It was a mindset. Once I accepted that I didn't need to be understood to be justified, the rest followed naturally. I didn't feel lighter, I felt steadier. Because for the first time, my actions were no longer shaped by how they might be received. They were shaped by what I could sustain. From the outside, it looked like nothing was happening. That was intentional. I didn't disappear. I didn't cut contact abruptly. I didn't make a statement. I simply let the relationship exist at the level it naturally settled into when I stopped maintaining it. Silence, when sustained, becomes infrastructure. I reorganized my life in ways that didn't require announcement. I made long-term decisions with no reference to family input. Career moves, living arrangements, financial planning. Not out of secrecy, out of autonomy. Before, I would have shared these things reflexively as a way of staying connected. Now, I noticed how rarely sharing led to meaningful engagement. So I stopped offering access that wasn't being used. At work, this period coincided with a shift toward higher responsibility roles. I was entrusted with systems that required discretion and foresight. I excelled, not because I was trying to prove anything, but because my energy was no longer fragmented. I didn't need external reassurance to stay grounded. I had my own metrics now. What mattered most was that I made myself structurally independent, not just emotionally detached, but practically self-contained. I ensured that nothing essential in my life depended on parental support, financial, logistical, or emotional. Not because I anticipated abandonment, but because reliance had always created unspoken obligations. I wanted none. This wasn't about control. It was about freedom from expectation. They still reached out occasionally. A message, a call. Always polite, always brief, always on neutral ground. I responded in kind. There were no arguments to point to. No inciting incident they could reference later and say, that's when things changed. Because nothing happened. That was the brilliance of it. People only resist change when they can see it forming. Slow shifts bypass defense mechanisms. By the time absence is felt, it's already been normalized. I didn't withdraw affection. I withdrew availability. And availability, I learned, is what most relationships mistake for closeness. What they didn't notice was how much ground I was quietly covering. I made plans that extended years into the future, plans that assumed no family involvement by default. I cultivated friendships that were reciprocal. I built routines that didn't orbit holidays or expectations. I became, in every meaningful sense, complete. The quiet dominance wasn't about leverage over them. It was about having nothing left to negotiate. And when there's nothing to negotiate, power dynamics dissolve. By the time the consequences of my absence began to surface, I was already too established in my own life to be pulled back by guilt or confusion. Moving in silence isn't about secrecy. It's about letting your actions outpace other people's assumptions. And mine did. Consequences rarely arrive with explanations. They show up as an absence, as an inconvenience, as a subtle imbalance that people feel before they understand it. For a long time, my parents didn't notice anything was wrong. From their perspective, the relationship still existed. I replied when they reached out. I showed up occasionally. I was polite, calm, predictable, but something essential was missing. I wasn't anticipating their needs anymore. That was the first consequence. Small things began to slip. Plans were made with assumptions that no longer hold. Someone forgot I wouldn't be available on short notice. A responsibility lingered because I hadn't stepped in to manage it automatically. At first, these moments were brushed off as a coincidence. Timing issues, miscommunication, life is busy. But patterns don't stay invisible forever. I remember a phone call where my mother paused mid-sentence, clearly recalibrating. She had launched into a request, something logistical, something she assumed I would handle. When I didn't immediately say yes, there was a silence. Not anger, confusion. Oh, she said slowly, I just thought you'd be able to. The old version of me would have filled that gap. Reassured her, explained myself, adjusted. Instead, I said, I can't. No elaboration, no apology. The conversation continued, but something had shifted. I could feel it. Not emotionally, but structurally. The expectation had failed to land. That's when the consequences truly began. Not dramatic ones, subtle ones. They started checking before assuming. Not consistently, but occasionally. They sounded uncertain in ways they hadn't before. There was a hesitation where confidence used to be. Still, no one named it. People rarely confront the source of discomfort when they can reinterpret it as temporary. They told themselves I was busy, that this phase would pass, that I'd return to form. But I didn't. And over time, the gaps I used to fill remained empty. It's uncomfortable to realize how much stability someone provided only after they stop, especially when that stability was never acknowledged as such. I could sense the unease building, not as panic, but as a low-level awareness that something had changed and wasn't self-correcting. The strange thing was how calm I felt watching it unfold. Not satisfied, not vindicated, just resolved. Because this wasn't about teaching a lesson. It was about allowing reality to assert itself without interference. I didn't step in to rescue awkward moments. I didn't reassert my old role when things became inefficient. I let the system adjust, or struggle, on its own. And that struggle carried information. They began reaching out more frequently. Not with direct questions, but with small bids for engagement. Updates that didn't require a response. Comments designed to invite reassurance. I responded politely, briefly. Still no confrontation. Still no acknowledgement. That too was a consequence. The lack of clarity unsettled them more than conflict would have. Because conflict offers a script. This offered none. They couldn't accuse me of withdrawal. I was still there. They couldn't accuse me of coldness. I was kind. They couldn't demand closeness. They had never established how to ask for it. So they hovered in uncertainty, and I remained steady. The power shift wasn't visible, but it was unmistakable. For the first time, the emotional balance of the relationship was no longer weighted in their favor by my overfunctioning. They felt the loss without being able to name it, and I felt the relief of no longer compensating. That was the beginning of the end of the old dynamic. The moment they realized something was wrong didn't come with urgency, it came with anxiety. A subtle one at first. A nervous energy behind otherwise normal conversations. Questions that circled instead of landing. Statements phrased like tests. "You've been busy lately, huh? You seem different. We should talk more often." None of these were invitations. They were probes. They were feeling the absence now. Not as silence, but as loss of access. And because it hadn't been announced, they couldn't locate it. They didn't know what they were reacting to, only that something familiar was no longer available. For years, they had relied on my emotional predictability, my consistency, my willingness to be flexible without being asked. And now that predictability had dissolved, they didn't know how to respond to that. So they did what people often do when control slips quietly. They tried to restore the previous pattern without acknowledging it had changed. My mother began calling more frequently, but the calls stayed shallow. Updates, commentary, no real questions, as if proximity alone might reestablish closeness. My father sent messages framed as practical check-ins. Neutral, safe, nothing that required vulnerability. They were reaching out, but not reaching in. And that distinction mattered, because by the time they noticed the distance, I had already adjusted my expectations. I wasn't waiting for them to ask the right question anymore. I wasn't hoping they'd finally see the pattern. I had moved past the phase where repair was possible without real acknowledgement. That's what made it too late. Not the timing, but the approach. They wanted things to feel normal again. I needed things to be honest. Those two desires were incompatible. There was one conversation that crystallized this for me. My mother said lightly, "You know you can always talk to us, right?" The old version of me would have nodded. The accommodating one. The one who carried potential conversations like emotional luggage. Instead, I paused. Not long, just long enough. And I realized that statement wasn't true. Not because they were unkind, but because the relationship had never made space for my interior world. Talking had always been permitted in theory, but not held in practice. So I said, "I know," and left it there. The silence afterward was uncomfortable. She didn't press. Neither did I. That's when I knew the window had closed. Repair requires curiosity. Repair requires accountability. Repair requires risk. They were offering familiarity. Familiarity had already failed. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clear. The panic, when it came, wasn't dramatic. It was disorganized. Missed cues, mixed signals, a sudden desire to reconnect paired with no understanding of how. They wanted closeness without disruption. I needed a change without performance. By then, my life no longer had space for emotional labor that went nowhere. I had built something stable, internally and externally, and I wasn't willing to destabilize it for the sake of appearances. The hardest part to accept was this. They weren't trying to hurt me now. They were trying to restore access. And access is not the same as intimacy. It was too late to fix it because the version of me who would have accepted surface-level repair no longer existed. I had outgrown the role that made their version of connection functional. That doesn't make them villains. It just makes the timing real. Some relationships don't end because of cruelty. They end because one person grows past the emotional ceiling of the dynamic. And once that happens, going back feels like shrinking. I didn't shrink. I stayed where I was. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't feel like one. There was no build-up, no rehearsed speech, no emotional surge I had to control. If anything, it felt administrative, like closing a file that had been left open for too long. We were sitting together, the three of us, in a familiar setting. The kind of place where big emotions used to feel inappropriate. My parents looked slightly uneasy, though neither of them could have explained why. The atmosphere was polite, careful. My mother was the one who spoke first. "I feel like you've been distant," she said. Not accusing, just stating it, as if testing whether the word would hold. I nodded. "I have been." That was it. No defense, no softening. The simplicity seemed to catch them off guard. My father asked, "Did we do something?" That question mattered. Not because it was wrong, but because it came so late. I didn't list grievances. I didn't recount moments or explain the history in detail. I had already done that work internally. Repeating it now would have been an attempt to be understood, rather than an expression of truth. So I said, "We've had different expectations of our relationship for a long time." I adjusted to that. Eventually, I stopped. Silence followed, not angry silence, processing silence. My mother looked at me, searching my face, not for pain, but for emotion. Something familiar she could respond to. I wasn't offering it. "I didn't know you felt that way." "I know," I replied. That was the hardest sentence to say. Not because it was sharp, but because it was final. They waited for more, for elaboration, for reassurance that this was temporary, that we could fix it if we just talked enough. But there was nothing to fix in the way they meant it. I'm not upset, I continued calmly. I'm not trying to punish anyone. I just don't want to go back to the version of me who made everything work by being invisible. That was the closest I came to naming the wound. There were no raised voices, no tears, just a quiet recalibration of reality. My father nodded slowly. So, what does this mean? I considered the question, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I wanted to choose the right level of honesty. It means this is how I show up now, as says I says, less available, more contained, still caring, but differently. They didn't argue. They didn't agree. They absorbed it. I could see the confusion behind their eyes, not because the words were unclear, but because they required a rewrite of the narrative they'd been living with. The one where I was always fine, always adaptable, always there. That narrative had ended. The conversation didn't last long after that. There was nothing more to extract from it. No emotional resolution waiting just around the corner. And that was okay. When I left, there was no sense of collapse, no grief surge, just a quiet confirmation that I had told the truth without abandoning myself. That's what confrontation without heat looks like. Not victory, not reconciliation, just alignment. For the first time, my internal reality and my external behavior matched. I wasn't asking them to understand. I was informing them of a change that had already taken place. And in doing so, I closed the last door gently but firmly behind me. Who I am now doesn't look dramatic from the outside. There was no reinvention montage, no radical break, no declaration of independence that required witnesses. If you met me today without context, you might not notice anything unusual at all. And that's the point. I am quieter than I used to be, but not smaller. More selective, but not closed. Less available, but more present. The biggest change is internal. I no longer organize myself around being easy to live with. I don't preemptively soften my needs or compress my reactions so they fit more comfortably into other people's expectations. I still care about my appearance. That never disappeared. Care doesn't vanish just because proximity changes. But care without self-erasure now has a boundary around it. I don't reach for them reflexively. I don't manage their emotions for them. I don't translate my life into fragments that feel safe enough for them to consume without engagement. I let the relationship be what it is. And strangely, that has made me more honest, not less. In other areas of my life, the shift has been unmistakable. I choose relationships where curiosity moves in both directions, where silence doesn't default to assumption, where presence is mutual, not extracted. I no longer mistake being needed for being valued. That distinction alone changed everything. At work, I'm known as someone steady, but not invisible. Someone whose silence signals thought, not compliance. I speak less, but when I do, it carries weight because it isn't padded or over-explained. That's the quiet dominance people misunderstand. It's not control, it's coherence. I move through my life without the background noise of emotional debt. I don't owe anyone access simply because I've always provided it. I don't confuse history with entitlement. And I don't feel guilty about that anymore. The guilt faded slowly. Not because I argued myself out of it, but because I stopped acting against myself. Guilt has nothing to feed on when your behavior aligns with your values. My value is simple now. I will not disappear to keep the peace. That doesn't mean I'm confrontational. It means I'm exact. There's a calm that comes from knowing you're not waiting to be seen. Knowing your sense of self doesn't depend on someone else finally understanding your silence. If my parents one day choose to engage differently, with real curiosity, real accountability, real presence, I'm open to that, not desperate. Not guarded, just open. And if they don't, my life remains whole. That's the difference. I used to believe distance meant loss. Now I understand that distance can be a form of respect, for yourself and for others. It removes the pressure to perform a closeness that doesn't exist. Who I am now is someone who doesn't chase emotional recognition from people who learn to love her from afar. I don't need to be missed to matter. I don't need to be understood to be grounded. I don't need to be central to be complete. I'm no longer the easy one. I am the honest one. For a long time, I thought the story needed a lesson sharp enough to justify the distance. A clear right and wrong, a moment where someone realizes what they lost. Some visible consequence that would make the choice feel validated. But that was the old way of thinking, the part of me that still believed my experiences needed external confirmation to be real. The truth is quieter. Nothing catastrophic happened after I stepped back. No one's life fell apart. No dramatic apologies arrived in the mail. The world kept moving, so did I. And that's the moral most people don't expect. Sometimes, emotional justice doesn't look like balance being restored. Sometimes it looks like imbalance no longer being tolerated. My parents didn't lose a daughter. They lost a version of me that was endlessly accessible. A version that smoothed over gaps, absorbed discomfort, and made connection effortless by doing most of the work alone. And I didn't lose parents. I lost the hope that they would one day notice me if I just stayed quiet long enough. That hope was heavier than any distance I live with now. What the unopened letters taught me wasn't that my parents didn't care. It was that care, without curiosity, can still leave someone unseen. And being unseen, especially for a long time, teaches you how to survive without being held. There's no villain here, no one to punish, no speech that would have fixed it. There's just a reality many people recognize but rarely name. Some relationships are built on versions of you that are no longer sustainable. Walking away from that doesn't make you cold. Staying doesn't make you loyal. It just means you're choosing differently. If there's one thing I want you to take from this, it's this. Silence isn't always avoidance. Distance isn't always rejection. And leaving quietly can be an act of deep self-respect. You don't owe people unlimited access just because they're familiar. You don't owe explanations to those who never asked how you were. And you don't need permission to stop disappearing. If you've been the easy one, the reliable one, the one who doesn't need much, this isn't an invitation to cut people off. It's an invitation to ask yourself a harder question. Are you being loved or are you being accommodated? Because those two things feel similar until you stop making yourself small. If this story resonated with you, I'd really like to hear your perspective. Have you ever stepped back from a relationship not out of anger, but because you realized you were the only one holding it together? Tell me in the comments.